All right, I'm Melanie. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book by an author named John McPhee. And in this piece of the book, the author is walking in the Cascades Wilderness in the state of Washington with David Brower, who was the head of the Sierra Club for about 2 decades in the 50s and the 60s and did a lot to make the Sierra Club more popular. And they're also walking with a miner named Charles Park. And David Brower and Charles Park have conversations about the wilderness and about the needs of modern man and mining and what would happen to this wilderness if we were to mine the copper that's under it. And this was written in about 1970 or 71. Okay. A small cabin stands in the Glacier Peak Wilderness, about 100 yards off a trail that crosses the Cascade Range. In midsummer, the cabin looked strange in the forest. It was only 12 feet square, but it rose fully 2 stories and then had a high and steeply peaked roof. From the ridge of the roof, moreover, a 10-foot pole stuck straight up. Tied to the top of the pole was a shovel. To hikers shedding their backpacks at the door of the cabin on a cold summer evening, as 5 of us did, it was somewhat unnerving to look up and think of people walking around in snow perhaps 35 feet above, hunting for that shovel, then digging their way down to the threshold. Men from the Chelan County Snow Survey use the cabin in winter while they measure snow depths and snow densities and figure how much runoff to expect at the time of the thaw. Because of the almost unbelievable amount of snow that can accumulate in this part of the state of Washington, what they do is a vital matter to the people below and even far beyond the mountains. What we were doing there was something else again. We were tired. We had walked 7.5 miles uphill since 3 that afternoon. One of us was in his 60s, another in his 50s, and all of us saw the cabin as a haven from what obviously would have been very cold ground. Until midsummer, the trails had been impassable, and to make the trip, we had to wait for the winter snows to melt. An entry in the register in the cabin said that snow had fallen 1 week earlier, August 5th. But we had been drawn to the Cascades in part because a great many people believed that they were the most beautiful mountains in the United States. A somewhat smaller and on the whole more parochial group felt that these huge conical peaks, raised in volcanic fire and later carved by moving ice, were the most beautiful mountains in the world. In 1964, the United States Congress set aside this region and others as permanent wilderness, not to receive even the use given a national park, not to be entered by a machine of any kind except in extreme emergency, not to be developed or altered or lumbered forevermore. Within the structure of this so-called Wilderness Act, however, was a provision known as the mining exception. All established claims would remain open to mining, and new claims would be made in any wilderness until 1984. At the foot of Glacier Peak, in the center of this particular wilderness, is a copper lode that is 1/2 mile from side to side. The Kennecott Copper Corporation has a patented claim on this deposit and could work it at any time. We wanted to have a look at the region while it was still pristine. The others left it to me to add their names to the register in the cabin. Charles Park, geologist, mineral engineer, who believes that if copper were to be found under the White House should be removed. David Brower, who has been described by Stuart Udall as the most effective single person on the cutting edge of conservation in this country, leader of an organization called Friends of the Earth, and Larry Snow and Lance Brigham, medical students from the University of Washington who were along to help with the logistics of the trip and perhaps incidentally to give first aid. Not far into the mountains from their eastern extremity at Lake Chelan, we had come to an oddly formal landmark. It was a sign that said, "You are now entering the Glacier Peak Wilderness Area." In other words, take one more step and by decree you will enter a preserved and separate world. You will pass from civilization into wilderness. Wilderness was now that definable, that demonstrable, and could be entered in the sense that one enters a room. Park said, "Will they let me carry my pick in there?" "Until 1984, said Brower. We stepped across the line. I said, "If we get lost in here with that pick, we may discover a new copper deposit." Brower said, "If you make a new discovery, I'm here to see that you don't get out." We moved on into the wilderness. The trail was dusty. It was covered with a light brown powder too fine to be called sand. Park said it was glacial flour, finely ground rock coming out of the ice of the past and ice of the present. Far above us in the high cirques were glaciers, the Lyman Glacier, Isella Glacier, Mary Green Glacier, and perhaps prophetically, the Company Glacier on Bonanza Peak. The sky was blue and cloudless, a day to remember in the Cascades. Brower said he was disappointed that it was not raining. He explained that he did not like dry duff, but preferred the feel and the beauty of a wet and glistening forest, vaporous and dripping. He said that he hoped we would be fortunate enough to have a good rain before the trip was over. He labored slowly up the trail, taking it conservatively, eating thimbleberries and huckleberries as he moved along. There are no really old rocks in the Cascades, Park said, nicking a rock in passing. He picked up and admiringly turned in his hand a piece of pistachio green epidote. 200 yards up the trail, he rapped at an outcropping with his pick and said, "That's volcanic." Minutes later, he swung again, sent chips flying, and said, "That is contact rock." This in some way entertained Brower, who laughed and shook his head. A serrated ridge several miles from the trail had a reddish glow in the late afternoon light. "See that color? That's pyrite," Park said, pointing. "Copper often comes with it. If I were in here looking for copper, that's where I'd head." The copper terrain we wanted to see was still more than 10 miles away, however, and we stayed on the trail. We passed a big Douglas fir at least 6 feet in diameter that had crashed to the earth in recent past, and Brower said how nice it was to see it there, to know that some lumber company had never had a chance at it, to see the decay stage of a natural cycle, the forest reclaiming its own. "If dead trees are not left to rot," he said, "the ecology of the wilderness is disturbed." Park kept his reactions to himself. His eye wandered to a square hole in a cedar stump. He waved his pick in the direction of the stump and said, "Pileated woodpecker." We moved on. After a series of switchbacks had lifted us 700 feet in less than a quarter of a mile, we stopped to rest by a stream that was alternately falling through the air and racing down the mountainside. Everywhere, from every slope, the Cascades cascade. Water shoots out of cracks in the rock. It falls over the edges of cliff. It foams, sprays, runs, and plunges, pure and cold. Enough snow and rain fall up there to irrigate Libya, and when water is not actually falling from the sky, the sun is melting it from alpine ice. Down the dark green mountainsides go streamers of white water, and above the timberline, water shines against the rock. In every depression is a tarn, and we had passed a particularly beautiful one a little earlier. From the escarpment, we're looking back at it now. It was called Heart Lake and was fed by a stream that in turn fell away from a high and deafening cataract. The stream was interrupted by a series of beaver ponds. All around these free-form pools were stands of alder, aspen, Engelmann spruce, and in the surrounding mountains just under the summits were glaciers and fields of snow. Brower, who is an esthetician by trade and likes to point to beautiful things, had nothing to say at that moment. Neither did Park. I was remembering the words of a friend of mine in the National Park Service who had once said to me, "The Glacier Park wilderness is probably the most beautiful piece of country we've got. Mining copper there would be like hitting a pretty girl in the face with a shovel. It would be like strip mining the Garden of Eden." Park wiped his forehead with his hat. I dipped a cup into the stream and offered him a drink. He hesitated. "Well, why not?" he said at last. He took the cup and he drank, put the cup down with a smile, wiped his lips, and said, "That's good stuff. It's melted glacier ice, isn't it?" Park nodded and swallowed a little more. Soon after we were again on the trail, we went around the north edge of a lake that had a surface of at least 90 acres and was almost as big as the glacier that was dripping into it from 1,400 feet above. The effect of glacial flour in still water is to turn it green. As we moved uphill and looked back, we saw that there were 3 other green lakes closer to the glacier. In them, small icebergs were drifting. Ahead of us and far above was a ridge that ran north-south and dipped at one point to form a shallow notch. This was our immediate destination, and it had been named Cloudy Pass because the most distant view a person usually has there of his own groping hands. On this day, though, the sky was without clouds anywhere. The climb was steep toward the pass, and we tended to string out. Brower, in the lead, said again that he wished it were raining. I asked him if by his own standards he would describe the terrain we were in as wilderness. "Yes, it is wilderness," he said. "The Sierra is what I love, but these mountains are perhaps the most beautiful we have." Then he accelerated his pace and was soon far ahead. He seemed to be feeling good, getting into the rhythm with the mountains. A mosquito bit Park on the wrist, and he slapped it. "They follow the snow," he said. "The higher we get, the more mosquitoes there are." We climbed down in silence for a while, and then he asked why Brower had gone on so far ahead. "I don't know, he seems to want to be alone," I said. He certainly is, let's say, reserved, Park said. I don't see how anyone could ever break through it. I almost called him yesterday when he said the big trees ought to be left to rot in the forest. Long before they fall, they are dying from the inside out. It's a shame not to use big trees like that. He waved his pick at a stand of spruce. I am not a member of the Sierra Club, he went on. I don't approve of their policy. To me, they are preservationists, not conservationists. You can't avoid change. You can direct it, but you can't avoid it. I like Sierra Club books, though.